These changes are not applicable to Imperial County, California for this year, but next year they will be applicable for the 2025 crop year. All right, so going through the agenda for today, first we're going to just review the policy changes due to early harvest now becoming an option. We do have some question and answer that we have gotten from RMA and NCIS. We do still have some outstanding questions, but we've gotten a lot cleared up, especially in the past week. And then we're also going to go through a system demo in case you haven't seen or heard. Our system did get released with the basics of early harvest now being available. So looking at early harvest adjustment option, in order to be eligible for this, by sales closing, the insured may elect the early harvest adjustment option. This is only available on additional coverage policies. It is not available on CAT. In order to elect it, you're going to want to put that EH option on an application or policy change form. It must be available in the actuarial documents. Now, as of right now, we are not aware of any county where sugar beets are insured where this is not available. So it should be available, or there's no known abnormalities there with it not being available where sugar beets are available. And then it is elected by insured entity on a crop county basis. So we're going to get into that a little bit more too, and the significance of that with potentially master yields. And then it is continuous until canceled. So just some of the basics here. What the early harvest option does is it allows the insured to adjust early harvested actual yields. So looking at those pre-haul acres and yields that the processors such as Crystal or Mindac would ask the insured to do. What it does, it increases harvested production by 1% per day, and it applies for each day harvested before the date of full maturity. In our area, that is October 1st. So any day before that, you would get an extra 1% per day. It does only apply, and there are some asterisks here because there is some verification required by either the company or the agent, but it does only apply when a processor requires acreage to be harvested early, when the insured harvests acreage early, unless that there is production damage by an insurable cause and leaving crop in the field would reduce production. And in that case, early harvest would not be applied. Again, it only applies to the early harvested acreage. This next bullet point is a change. It only applies when early harvested acreage is at least 15% of the total unit. Now, previously that threshold was 10%. And then the early harvest adjustments are limited or capped to not exceed greater than the regular harvested yield or approved APH yield. And then another new clarification, early harvest actual yields are not subject to the capping threshold. So looking at what this looks like in the APH database, if we do have early harvest elected by sales closing, the insured can choose by production reporting date whether to adjust the qualifying early harvested actual yield or not. Now, the default is going to be to apply it to everything or wherever it is available. So in order to say you don't want that, you have to opt out, but we'll get into that in just a little bit here. The choice is by APH database and eligible crop year. There is no limit to how many eligible yields can be adjusted. So wherever you meet that requirement, you could adjust it if need be. The amount of harvested production is increased 1% per day for each day prior to the date of full maturity. That adjustment is going to apply to all eligible early harvested actual yields. And then if the insured chooses to retain and use any actual yields, so this would be what prior to being adjusted, even if they are eligible for early harvest, they have to notify the AIP in writing by production reporting date. And we'll show you how on the production report you are able to do that. Then if you do opt out of using this option, those yields don't go into your approved yield determination. But the early harvest production must be included in the APH database. Just a note here, if you haven't already and you deal with sugar beets, I would suggest getting very familiar with this paragraph in the crop insurance handbook. It is paragraph 923. This is where everything regarding early harvest adjustment is found, all of those rules. So now moving into the recertification part, I know that this has been a big question and a big topic of discussion the past couple months as we've been working through this. We have gotten some more clarification from RMA on this. So all carryover insureds must recertify 2020 through 2023 production quantities, where they were mandatory to adjust that production. Now, in our spring update meeting, we did have 2019 listed there. We have since sent a memo or announcement out to agents saying that RMA recently clarified that since 2019 is out of the record retention period, that is not a mandatory year to be recertified. And then also just a reminder there that if you have an insured who has not had any early harvest in those past years, we would not need to recertify. We only need to recertify if there was early harvest and if it was 2020 to 2023. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go back further. Production for 2019 and prior can be recertified even though they're beyond the record retention period. And then if production quantities from years 2020 to 2023 aren't recertified and we find out that they should have been, assigned yield procedures will apply. Now we're still waiting for full clarification from RMA in terms of what approved yield to use when we are assigning those yields. So hopefully we don't run into those situations, but just know that we're still waiting for some clarification there. And looking at cancellation and transferring of policies with early harvest, if we do get into future years where the insured decides that they don't want early harvest anymore, they have to cancel it by the applicable cancellation date. When it is canceled, that means that those production quantities that were adjusted are no longer used in the approved yield calculation. But other yield adjustments may apply, such as yield substitutions, yield exclusions. Cups may or may not apply depending on if there was a change to the approved yield, and then yield floors could potentially apply as well. And then just to note, like most options, transferring a policy to a different AIP does cancel that EH option. So in order to keep the option, the insured must elect it on their transfer application to that new AIP by the sales closing date. Looking at written agreements, I know in our area, at least, we don't see a lot of written agreements on sugar beets. But just so that you are aware, written agreements can be eligible for early harvest if early harvest is allowed in the crop county actuarial document. So what we mean by that is, for example, high risk written agreements where that crop is already insurable, the option is already in the actuarial documents. The exceptions here is that we can't do a written agreement to add the option. So if we have a practice where only non-irrigated is insurable and we're requesting the irrigated practice to be insurable, we can't request to also add EH to that written agreement. And then also if we are doing an XC written agreement where sugar beets weren't insurable in the county, we can't request to add the EH option. We would just be requesting for insurability on the sugar beets. So looking at the early harvest interaction with different yield options, I do know we have gotten some questions in regards to our APH option matrix. Just know that we are working on creating a new kind of options cheat sheet matrix instead of adding early harvest to our existing APH options matrix. It just gets to be a little bit too much, and especially when this option only applies to one crop. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully we should have that ready for you in the near future. And what that is going to do is it's going to explain how the different options work with early harvest. So kind of going through it, if early harvest is elected, those databases still remain eligible for yield floor. But if we are using, if the approved yield is using an early harvest yield, it's not eligible for a yield floor. Cups may apply. We're still waiting for some further clarification from RMA on this, but ultimately the simple answer here is that cups will not apply if there is a yield change, but cups could still potentially apply even with early harvest. Trend adjustment will apply to the adjusted yield like normal. And then just a note here on the interaction with yield exclusion and yield adjustment, the insured can have all three options elected on their coverage, but only one option can be applied to the actual yield. And with this, the order of precedence here is early harvest and then yield exclusion and yield adjustment. So with this, if we have an early harvest adjusted yield, we are going to use that. If the insurer does not want to use that, we would have to opt out, and then it would go to if they want to use YE or not. If they're going to opt out of YE as well, then YA can apply. But just good thing to remember here, you can elect all three options, but only one option can be applied to an actual yield. And then just looking at how this looks in the APH database again. So once the yields are recertified, they remain in subsequent years unless the insured cancels EHA for the crop or notifies us in writing by the production reporting date on an APH or production reporting form to change which eligible yields are or are not adjusted. And then if the insured chooses to no longer adjust an eligible early harvest actual yield, the unadjusted actual yield is used to calculate APH. And both the adjusted and actual yields are still subject to APH review. So impact of early harvest when master yield is elected. This was one of our big outstanding questions that we had at the time of the spring update meetings. I am happy to say that we got some answers. So hopefully this makes sense what we're going to go through here. So for master yield policies, on non-summary APH databases, what we are going to do is we're going to apply those adjustments on the child units. So on the non-summary databases. And then the insured can designate which years are opted in or out for early harvest by production reporting date. So again, we apply early harvest. We're going to look at those adjustments, applying them on the child units. And then when we get up to the master yield summary database, then we're going to apply really every other APH option, the YA, YETA, figuring out, if we want to opt out of YE, all of that is done on the master yield summary database. And then we're going to determine average yields, approved yields, and rate yields on the master yield summary database. So what we are doing is we're still going to determine that approved yield when we have master yields on the master yield summary database. So then to sum this up, when we are summarizing the early harvest production on master yields, we're going to look at 3 different steps here. If we have early harvest elected and applied, we're going to use the early harvest production to go into the master yield summary database. If early harvest is not applied or opted out, we are going to use the actual production. And if there is no early harvest production, then again, we're going to use the actual production. So I'm going to show you an example of this. And when we get into our system too, it'll hopefully make a little bit more sense. But this information is going to display on one master unit summary database with multiple columns. So I'm going to go. So looking here, here's an example that our business analysts put together when they were going back and forth with RMA to make sure that we had our calculations correct. We just, like I said, we just received clarification or confirmation on this yesterday. So I will throw out the disclaimer that our system is not done yet for master yields. We have only programmed the basic columns for early harvest. But I know IT is starting to work through those as we get more answers too. So looking at this example, on the left here, we have got 2 individual units. Here just kind of shows what your approved yields would look like with or without early harvest, without the master yield, kind of showing that jump from the gap between your rate yield of, like, for example, here an 85.47 up to your approved yield with early harvest all the way up to a 99.02. But ultimately, when we're looking at the master yield, we are going to essentially take, so if we're going back through the 3 steps here, if we have early harvested actual or early harvested adjusted production, sorry, we're going to put that amount into our master yield calculation. Now, if we don't have early harvest or it is being opted out, we are going to use actual production. So for the example of 2016, what we are getting here, so this actual production, this is still the adding of this column right here. So these, we've got 2 units with 2016 production, the 1,195,395 and then 650,999. Now for the master yield, we have one database that has early harvest adjusted production and the other that doesn't. So we're going to add in this column with the early harvest adjusted production with the actual production. That's where we get this this value here of the 1,887,37. So there you can see how much of a jump it is for this one unit. About 300 or 250 extra pounds of coverage. Now, the same thing goes year by year. 2023, I'm just going to show another example here. Here for this unit, we have early harvest adjusted production, but this one is blank because we're opting out. And I'll show you in the system a little bit later what that's going to look like. But again, just like with that first one, where we're either don't have adjusted production or we are opting out, we're going to use this actual production number to add in with any adjusted production. So then here you can see the difference. This column here is without early harvest and this column is with early harvest. So just kind of showing the difference between the 2. So I know we were excited to get some answers on master yields, and hopefully that makes sense. Looking at some impacts of early harvest when you do have master yield elected. Now remember from earlier, you can elect by, or each entity can make their own election by, or for early harvest, sorry. But when it comes to master yields, if a master yield, or for a master yield, if early harvest is elected by the operator and that's being used for multiple people, then essentially they have to all have the same EHA elections. If they do not, then standard APH procedures would apply. So again, you have the ability to elect the option by entity, but if you have multiple entities going into the same master yield, you're going to want to either have all the same elections for early harvest, or they're not going to get to use the master yield. Looking at impacts of simple average T yields, it doesn't affect any, early harvest doesn't affect any added land or new crop practice type variety procedures. What it does do is it changes that calculation. So just like most options like TA and YE, we are going to use the adjusted yield for the SAT calculation if the database has early harvest. If it is not using early harvest adjustment, then you can use that approved yield in the calculation. And then other calculations and requirements do remain unchanged. Just a reminder that if we do have a master yield elected, simple average T yields are not applicable. But if you do not have a master yield, you could still potentially have SAT yields. And then just a reminder that SAT yields are still determined by the crop year that the APH database is established. So then looking at what is this going to look like for reporting purposes? Since we do have the new insured production reporting requirement, this is going to be a situation that we are going to need 2 production reports. First, we are going to need, for the 2023 requirement for insured production reporting, we are going to need to have a production report based on the rules as of 2023. So this can be done on your normal 2023 production report, 2023 schedule, something like that. With this, when we talk about the old rules, this is where early harvest was automatically included in the production calculation, and we had a 10% threshold. This is something that you can use our early harvest Excel spreadsheet. If you haven't seen that or have any questions on that, just get in touch with your underwriter and they will be able to help you find that spreadsheet. And then what we are going to do here is we're going to key the information into the 2023 crop year, just like the rest of the crops under that current year APH. And once we do that, that is going to satisfy the requirement for insured production reporting for 2023. Then looking forward to 2024, you will need to file an additional production report with the APH recertification. So just a reminder there, we have to recertify yields from 2020 to 2023 where there was early harvest. So we'll go through some question and answers that take a pretty deep dive into this, but just another reminder there. So then in additional to the actual pounds of raw sugar, the insured must also report daily early harvested acres. RMA has clarified that they will allow estimates. I know that's one thing that we have heard, that it's hard to get exact numbers there. So RMA will allow estimates. And then again, these separate entries, you can also use our new 2024 spreadsheet. We do have some more updates coming to that spreadsheet for bypass or corral acres, so stay tuned there. And then we want to have harvest dates on there, and then pounds of raw sugar or tonnage and percent sugar. And then just a reminder that early harvest will not apply if production was not reported separately. And then once we get everything all recertified, you will key that recertified information in the 10-year database. So looking at just some more yield stuff or yield calculations, if we have early harvest not elected, your approved yield, the calculation there is not going to change. We're still going to apply all those options to the master yield if elected or on individual units. And then when early harvest is elected, we are going to add that into the approved yield calculation. And then looking at the rate yield and adjusted yield. So if early harvest isn't elected, we are going to look at the rate yield as being the greater of the average actual yields or adjusted actual yields. If early harvest is elected, the rate yield is going to be the average of early harvest yields. And then the adjusted yield, that value is going to be determined if it had not been applied. Looking at sugar beet production for unharvested non-loss situations, this isn't anything new. This was just another update to the handbook where they reorganized and renumbered some items in paragraph 1923. This is where if we have non-loss units where there's unharvested due to processors' lack of capacity, just some clarification that if greater than 50% of the acreage is harvested, we may use the harvested production. And then number 4 there, if less than 50% is harvested, an appraisal is required. And just so you know too, we do, one of our outstanding questions to RMA is regarding if we have a situation where there is greater than 50% of the acreage in the field is harvested, so that number 2 applies, and we can use the production from the acreage for APH purposes. But if we have a combination of that and pre-haul acres, you know, what yield do we use for APH purposes? So, and then just one other clarification for sugar company delivery records to be acceptable. They must show pounds of raw sugar or net paid tons or pounds of beets delivered and percent of raw sugar. So just going through some items here, some key takeaways or differences, things to highlight. Early harvest adjustment is now an option. It is no longer automatically included in the policy like it was from 2019 to 2023. It has to be elected by sales closing date. If that option is elected, the insured selects specific APH databases and yields to apply the upward adjustment. The one change here really is that the minimum acreage threshold to trigger the early harvest is increased from 10 to 15%. And then all insureds will have to recertify for production from crop years where EHA was mandatory and applied to the production total. And then the last point here, only those producers electing the option will see their premium amount increase based on the selected years for adjustment. So now I have some Q&As that we have have gotten from either RMA or NCIS. I'm not going to go through all of them. I do want to touch on a couple of them. These will all be available in the slide deck after the call. So just wanted to touch on a couple here. So the first, some of these are still the same from the spring update meeting, but a lot of them are new. So this number one, should loss procedures gather actual and EH adjusted production regardless of the election of the option? Thinking ahead if the option is added or withdrawn in a future crop year. So here the answer is yes, regardless of the optional election, they should still be gathering those stage codes in loss procedures. Now, one thing to note, in order to get that early harvest adjustment, even with claims, they have to have the early harvest option elected. So that option or the factor will not be applied unless the option is elected. Question number 3 here, what are the impacts to premium? We have had a lot of questions regarding this. One thing to note, I mean, this is a new rate neutral option, meaning that there is no surcharge. So there's nothing that the insured will get charged just by having the option. Where you get charged is really where that gap is from your adjusted yield to your approved yield, just like TA, YE, quality loss, yield cup, all of those. So the more that the option helps you, the higher your premium rate is. So if you do have insureds that are already used or already have some of those options, it probably won't be as big of a sticker shock when you're quoting and looking at the premium rates on this, because you already have that gap between the adjusted and approved yield. But just like everything, you don't get the extra coverage without having to pay for it. It's just that it's not a surcharge across everything. So now getting into some recertification questions. We have had a lot of these. And I know it's impossible to go through every scenario. So as you have questions that come up, please don't hesitate to contact myself or your underwriter, and we'll walk you through what is all needed. But going into question number 7 here, if the insured chooses to not recertify years outside of the retention period, do those years go by the wayside and are eliminated from the APH database? And ultimately the answer is no. We can't take years out of the database. They're just outside of that retention period and are not required to be recertified. Then looking at the next one here, must all producers recertify or only the ones that had early harvest adjustment within record retention period? To recertify, do they need to meet 15% minimum acreage requirement for the previous years? So again, they're only required to recertify years within the record retention period, which is 2020 to 2023 APH yields. They can go beyond that if they want. The 15% threshold is going to, that's going to apply to all APH databases and years being recertified. So we understand that before there was the 10% threshold, but now 2024 going forward, for APH purposes, we're looking at that 15% threshold. Within that record retention period, all adjusted yields must be recertified, even if the early harvested acreage is below 15%. If the insured does not elect early harvest or the unit falls below the 15%, the unadjusted actual yield will be used. So I think that's something important to remember, that regardless of if you meet that 15% now or not, you still have to recertify to essentially unfactor anything that has been factored in the past 4 years. And then that kind of leads into number 9. If they don't elect the option, then do they not have to recertify? That is Correct. They have to recertify no matter if they elect the option or not. If the insured doesn't have any acres that were early harvested and adjusted within the record retention period, then they're not required to recertify. But if they have any acreage that was adjusted, then they have to recertify production for all acreage of that year. If we have a situation where acres were early harvested and the insured didn't recertify, then assigned yields would apply. So talking a little bit more about the threshold, just to be clear on this, we may run into situations where something was factored in the past because it met that 10%, but now it doesn't. Ultimately, what we have to do there, or if what we would do there is we would recertify the production to the actual unfactored production, and then they would not have the option to add in early harvest adjusted because they don't meet that 15% threshold. One thing to note here, in previous years, production information would have been calculated on losses as well. With the EHA threshold changing from 10% to 50% and being retroactive, will different production be reported on their APH than what was used for loss purposes? This is a situation that hopefully we don't run into too many, but we're not going to be going back and readjusting any claims that were paid in previous crop years, because at the time they were paid under the rules of early harvest being included in the policy. But now we will want to go through and recertify those yields recertify back to actual production, and then also include the 15% threshold for early harvest. So we could run into situations where we have production that is reported differently now than how it was reported on the claim. And this would be for the 2024 APH database going forward. And then we've got question on the cup. This is one that we're requesting a little bit more clarification on it, because ultimately they said that cups can apply with early harvest, but we're just verifying any production values. If they change, then the cup isn't applicable. So stay tuned for more clarification on that. And then assigned yields, like I said, hopefully we don't run into any scenarios where we have to assign yields, but if we find out that something should have been recertified and wasn't, then we would go to assigned yield procedures. Now RMA has said they'll use the prior year's approved yield. For the assigned yield, we're requesting some clarification. I know once we get into those previous years, it gets a little bit harder to figure out what the approved yield was at the time. And with that, I am going to stop here for a second before moving into the system, see if there's any questions or anything. Likely got anything?
And you guys can answer those questions or ask questions either in the chat or unmute your mic. So the first one we have here is, why would someone want to opt out?
That's kind of a hard question without looking at the actual database. Most times the production is going to be higher. We have seen some of those situations with the yield cap where the early harvest adjusted production is actually less. just due to that cap coming in. So that may be a scenario. The other scenario that I would advise you to look at is with yield exclusion. Like I mentioned, if you have yield exclusion and early harvest applying on a database, early harvest is going to apply first. So that would be a situation where if yield exclusion is actually going to give them a better yield, you're going to want to opt out of early harvest so that yield exclusion can apply. And I don't think I mentioned it, but so we do have the optimizer that I know a lot of people use for yield exclusion. We are in the process of updating that. It's not ready yet, just with the fact that mastery yields we haven't finished programming that yet. But just know that when the optimizer, this may be a bit confusing because the optimizer is going to run it at a master yield level and try and find the best approved yield. Whereas then you may have to go back and opt out of early harvest on those child units. So that's a scenario that or a couple scenarios that I can think of that you would want to opt out.
And then we had one more earlier just about the sugar beet worksheet. Is that one, I know you said, is that one up to date yet? Or where are we at with it?
So yeah, John Bertram has updated to version 5. I know he had a couple more items to fix before version 6 came out, but I would encourage you to get in contact with your underwriter and they can help you find that.
Any other questions out there? Again, this is the time to ask all those what ifs, nots, or whatever that's out there with in terms of Beet. So again, please feel free to ask some questions if you guys have any. Otherwise, I can go over the system.
All right, so I'm going to show a couple more slides and I'm going to switch over to the system. Hot off the press, just last night, we did release this into our system. Again, there's still a lot of stuff that we're adding in as fast as we can, but we did add in columns for early harvest yield, and early harvest opt-out. If you do have EH elected on the coverage screen, those will default to displaying. Oh, we got a question? Go ahead.
All right, another question came through the chat. Regarding claims, if EHA is not elected, a field is harvested early and production is below guarantee, will qualify for payment regardless if a cause of loss was in the field.
That I am not sure on. We can research that one and get back to you. That works. Okay. We'll keep going here. So like I said, if EH is elected on the coverage screen, these columns will automatically display. If EH is not elected, we have still given you the ability to view and enter in early harvest production, just because we know that there hasn't been a way to store this information before, and we don't want to go through the work of, figuring out if it's going to work or not, and then lose that information going forward. So if the option is not elected, there is a nice little sugar beet icon that you can click on within the unit, and that's going to display those extra columns. You will notice that there is not an opt-out column right now. That is because if you don't have the option on the policy, you don't have the option to opt in or out. This is more so just for, and it's not going to change any of the calculations, more so just for that viewing of, hey, what's it doing to the policy? We have updated permissions given these new recertification rules. You will have the ability to add or delete within the 3 new EH columns for all years in the APH database. You can modify the actual production for 2019 plus or going forward. Right now you are able to update claim and APH audit changes or audit information as well. And this is due to that requirement of needing to recertify everything. Just a reminder, I know we do live in a world of double clicking, but you will want to just single click in that field in order to edit it. And then any changes that you as an agent make, that will create a suspense item for us as underwriters. In our process right now, we're not requiring the hard copy records, but we are going to be kind of the ordinary. And then that now it's not quite up to date, but it will be once we get all those changes in regarding the master yield information we just found out. And then looking at Easy Quote, we're just recommending that you enter everything in Easy Writer Pro first, because then it will carry over to Easy Quote. If you are within the quote, you can use that scroll bar at the bottom. Now you can see those EH fields. And then here is just an example of the report when EH is included, so you can kind of see how much of a difference that early harvest makes. And then we've got documents. We have updated our documents with an extra couple columns there. If you go to the APH or Easy Mapping Production Yield Report, you will now see that there is early harvest production, early harvest yield, and early harvest opt-out. So here's where, if you're deciding that you want to opt out, you can put a yes or a no. I know some agents have already started that recertification process and have been doing a lot of handwritten work. Now that our system is ready, you could go in and key those changes and get a pre-printed APH filled out, and then that you can use that for recertifying. So I am going to stop there, and I'm going to switch over what I am sharing. Oh, it sounds like we got a question.
All right, so we had one question come in. I believe Stacy might have answered it, but are there any requirements to verify the number of acres that are early harvested?
So right now I don't think there is. Maybe I don't know if John or Megan are on the call and can help me out with that one. Otherwise, we'll get back to you on that one. Sorry about that. Michael, are there any other questions or anything else that I need to go over? Okay, so I was asked to talk about the quoter and where we are at with that. Stacy, I think you might still be on the line. I know a lot of it depended on the master yield. Right now you can quote anything that doesn't have a master yield. But I think everything else is dependent on the master yield changes. Is that correct, Stacy?
Yes, that is correct. Anything and everything around masters is pending. We did not do anything yet on that until we got our answers from RMA. But quoting, optimizer, if you have a policy without a master, which I know is few and far between, you can use quoting and the optimizer on those.
Good deal. Thank you, Stacy. Were there any other questions?
We got another one come in. Is the updated APH required to be sent into the underwriter?
It is not required. There may be certain situations where if we see something out of the ordinary, we are going to ask to take a closer look, but right now we are not requiring it. I have been suggesting if you've got it it doesn't hurt to send it to us, but it's not a mandatory item, just like our normal production reports.
Anyone else? If not, I think that will conclude our meeting for the day. Sam and I will stay on just for the next 15 minutes if you guys have a pressing question and you'd like to just ask it a little more one-on-one. But we just thank you guys for attending again. We will send out the slideshow. Be looking for that in an NAU country and announcement or from your underwriter either hopefully by the end of today to tomorrow. And then also be looking for the recording as well. We'll probably put that onto our agent portal as well if you guys want to come back and look at that. So again, we just thank you guys for attending. And you guys can stay on the line if you guys would like to ask any questions. Thank you all, and we'll chat with you soon.